Yeah? Great. Good day. My name is Krzysztof Kościuczuk. I have the utmost pleasure of joining you today, and thank you for your time and being here. We are recording this conversation on the occasion of the exhibition curated by Jeremy Deller at Kunstverein Hannover, who was invited by Christoph Platz. And one of the artists in the exhibition is Lara Favaretto, and Lara Favaretto has an ongoing project titled Thinking Head, throughout which she invites different individuals to reflect on, to discuss, and to look at from different perspectives at a set of notions that she has identified as important for the understanding of what a human being is and how I understood it and how we function in the end. I think the most interesting and at the same time challenging aspect of it is that aside from the one notion we are invited to reflect on or discuss or struggle, if you wish, there is no script to this meeting. So I would kindly ask you to introduce yourselves. Today we have alphabetically Raven Chacon, David Riff, and Jasmin Trächtler, and I would like you to say hello and perhaps introduce yourself using a few words in the sense of what you think is crucial regarding your practice for this conversation. Me, myself, I'm an art historian by education, and I work with exhibitions, and I have the pleasure of working with artists. But Raven, we are here also very honored because currently you have a solo exhibition at Kunstverein, so I would like to start with you, and I would like to ask you to introduce yourself, perhaps briefly.
I'm Raven Chacon. Really happy to be here. I've been here all week for the opening of the exhibition that I also worked with Krzysztof and Krzysztof Platz. And the work it's a very short exhibition. It's only up for 2 weeks, and it brings together some sound works that are from the earliest part of my career up till more recent works. And it also incorporates performance, so composing music is a big part of my work, and the reason I'm here another week is to do some performances and also do this talk.
I'm David Riff. I'm a curator, artist, sometimes writer. I'm at the moment working at the Steirische Herbst Festival in Graz, which happens every year, and I'm in the midst of preparing that. Yeah, what my practice really is centered around, though, are two things. As a curator, both as a curator and an artist, I'm very interested in narrativity, so like fiction and storytelling and how those things work in an art context. That's one thing I've been doing for years, and another thing that I'm heavily interested in is Soviet Marxism and Marxist aesthetics of the Soviet period, which, if we're talking about naivete, might actually be an interesting angle because it's a completely different world than the theoretical and practical parameters that we're used to working in, although there's a degree of convergence, which is also kind of interesting to talk about. So maybe, naivete coming from that position.
Yeah, my name is Jasmin Trächtler. I studied art history and philosophy, and then did my PhD in philosophy and work mainly in philosophy of language and feminist philosophy of science. And I can relate very much to what you just said, that from the perspective of a philosopher who thinks to overthink and over-reflect, then naivete is a very interesting concept to look at. So I'm very excited to have this conversation today.
Thank you. So we're here today on the occasion of the previous exhibition, and like I mentioned, we are here at the invitation of both Krzysztof and Lara Favaretto. The title of the previous exhibition that was curated by an outstanding artist, Jeremy Deller, was an exhibition for children and all other people. And I think this is not a coincidence that Lara has selected this notion, this concept, this idea of naivete to accompany this particular meeting. And so to kick off, I think we are all coming from very, very diverse backgrounds, which is a very precious thing. And I would like to ask maybe a quick backtrack a bit, and I would ask you, Jasmin, first. As I think we tend to, as artists and art historians, I'm speaking for myself now, we tend to think in images, although Raven is a great example of a person who thinks differently, maybe not immediately about images. But I would like to ask you, Jasmin, first, what is the image that comes to your mind when you think of naivete?
I guess also, of course, the image of a child, or like a person, a young person, a person maybe who's looks in an unbiased way towards the world. But then, of course, there are also other, I think, interesting layers to this concept. So when I started to think about this concept in sort of a small preparatory way for this talk, I started with this everyday notion of naivete as even often has this pejorative sense of someone who doesn't know something, although they should know, or haven't made a certain experience, although they should know. And then I noticed how complex and entangled this whole concept is in having even some political notions in there. If you think of women's naivete, for example, because they lack certain kinds of education, sexual education, for example, and that they couldn't know better in a way, although they should be because they were adult people. So I noticed then how difficult and entangled and complex this concept is, and also that sometimes you think of naivete as a beautiful place of this being unbiased and good-hearted, maybe too good-hearted for an evil world or something like that. So this is maybe my first picture of naivete.
Raven, what about you?
Yeah, the same. I mean the on one hand, there's I think of a child, someone very innocent, a kind of natural naivete, and on the other hand, I think of maybe the counterpart to that, the kind of somebody who is voluntarily ignorant about knowledge or wisdom or each other, thinking about our interactions with other people. So I think when I think of an image, it's not someone in isolation, it's somebody's interaction with others. And so a discussion about community becomes a big part of this, I think, as well. Interaction with others first, and then this becoming a way that one can start learning about what's beyond that, the universe, what the universe can teach somebody. And so somewhere between the two, both the kind of natural innocence and maybe a lack of access to knowledge also is part of this as well, versus somebody who just chooses not to engage with what they should be learning.
David?
Yeah, for sure. That's sort of the willful ignorance and a kind of feigned naivete, for sure, is part of our world. And I hadn't really thought of it before Raven mentioned it, because, I'm sort of like actually constantly being in a kind of cynical field where people are not naive and where any kind of naivete will be feigned, basically, or the sign of a newcomer. It always feels like that's really what you want most of all, is a naive audience, an audience that isn't looking for cues and keywords and formal markers, but that's actually willing to engage with a work. For an example, you're looking also for naive artists, actually, who aren't stuck in those same keywords and forms as a curator. So, of course, to me, naive already immediately seems like this shining, beautiful term of some other world where, that would only be possible in a world other than our own. But it's actually completely true, because people pretend to be naive. You see, I think that people also pretend to be politically naive about what's going on in the world a lot of the time, and pretend not to see things and sort of lead their lives idyllically, untouched by, so that's really an important thing to say right away, is that it always, any idyllic image we might have of naivete always comes with a degree of willful ignorance. And I was thinking about children, because you mentioned a child, and also this is in the context of Jeremy's exhibition, at least sort of the afterglow of Jeremy's exhibition. The children, when they're naive or so-called naive, there's a lot of parental production that goes into that too. Like to keep your children. Like in Germany, this is a big issue. When do you tell, not only when do you tell your children about sex, but when do you tell your children about the Holocaust? For how long do you protect them about all this information about colonialism, about the crimes against humanity that are going on now in Gaza, for an example, or in Ukraine? Can you talk to your children about this? And, oh yeah, no, you shouldn't. And so, in my kid, I have a 12-year-old son, and in his school, some of the parents actually really blocked this out. And in fact, during COVID, they didn't really want to talk about COVID either. So, naivete.
I think we're touching something that's already extremely productive, I would say, because we come with, it seems to me, we already come with a sort of understanding what is the flip side of naivete. And by this, we tend to define the naivete per se in itself. So this is my next question that I wanted to ask. What is the opposite? How we can kind of negatively, by subtraction perhaps, or how to contextualize. So what would be the opposite, David? Stupidity? What would be that? Ignorance? No.
No. I think we're very familiar with the opposite of naivete, of this kind of we've seen it all. Everything's been done before. Jadedness, especially in the art world.
Blasé.
And the kind of, and the result of that is very strange. It's not necessarily to pull people up to yourself, but actually then to talk down to people and to sort of it's all very complicated. Let me explain it to you in simple terms. And this kind of, I think art in the 20th century especially was very much a victim of its own jadedness, and at the same time of the completely crazy attempts in some cases to get beyond that, or to sort of counteract that with there's nothing worse than someone who's jaded and then pretends to be naive. This is what we were just saying before. So I think we know what that is. The art world's jadedness, for an example, vis-a-vis just its own history, even not only the world surrounding it. That's a whole other scandalous topic.
Mm-hmm. Raven, what would be the flip side of naivete for you?
I think this comes from thinking of one's own goals of trying to master something, become a master of your own field, of the technique of the work that you do, and so I think it's having some kind of goal of knowledge that you've attained, and then feeling that you can be in a position to tell others about what that is, that you have this knowledge, that it's very one is very certain in that knowledge as well. But I was thinking too, it was really interesting to go back to what parents might teach to children and shielding them. And so I think, yeah, then what is it that one is, when the time is right, to expose them to and give them this, maybe, I don't know, these certain things that this person has learned, this parent has learned, that they believe they're so certain about. And also it's the fabrication of other things. So, you know, not only shielding them from discussions that adults would have, but also fabricating new ones. Santa Claus, you know. so what is that doing? That's like generating more I don't know, false truths, and creating a whole nother kind of trajectory of knowledge that the young person would then fabricate on their own, you know, their own mythologies.
But that's extremely interesting, because I think that now we can see how the concept of truth kind of splits away from the idea of being naive or not being naive. It's exactly what you gentlemen mentioned. It's in the attempt to protect, I think, sometimes we lean not towards the truth, but we lean towards something that we know very well that is far from truth, or in our understanding it's a fabricated, it's a tale, it's a story. And then I think, however this concept might sound simple to us, it really goes to show that there is a very broad field of where idea of truth and good does not really converge, and it's something different. We do something with the intention of doing good, but we know very well that we are reproducing or sharing things that are not necessarily what we tend to accept as rational truths. So I think it's extremely interesting, and I wanted to ask you, Jasmin, coming from yet completely different field, how does that resonate with you? This idea, this perhaps split or perhaps crack, I'm not sure, I'm just trying to poke around it, between being naive and considering what is truthful or what is true.
Yeah, thanks. I think I relate very much to what both of you, David and Raven, said, and I think maybe there is a connection in that, maybe coming from this philosophical background, for me the opposite of naivete would also be like being skeptic, doubtful, suspicious, even paranoid maybe. And that's, for example, when we think of encounters with strangers, we don't know, should we trust them? So there's this relation between naivete and trust. And trust is also both about knowledge, but also about this ethical and being good or evil. And so if you think again about children, you spoke of protection, but that also requires a certain surrounding, or like a family that is able to protect you, and not all families are able to protect their children or other people. So in that sense, naivete is also a sort of privilege. You have not been made to have to know better. So you have not this kind of idea of growing up on the street where you constantly engage in difficult people, maybe even people with bad intentions or so, and then you learn, you just have to know better. You cannot stay naive, because naivete would mean sort of not being able to live. So in that sense, naivete is also this, you have the privilege of being trustful towards other people, maybe.
But would that mean that this is something that's irreversibly lost once it's lost? Or is it a place that we can still try and inhabit?
I think, so with concerning trust, there's this idea also that trust has maybe not in every instance, but there is this notion of trust, and that's also similar to naivete, that it has a posthumous character, as it's sometimes called in philosophy. So you notice that you have trusted someone sometimes only after the trust is gone, and you have noticed that you have been naive after you had been used or something. And I think that's interesting. I think maybe, of course, you can regain trust in someone or in the world, But maybe there's also this notion that something has died. So the trust or the naivete is gone. And also the childlike naivete, it's not something that we do not say of a child that it is, or he or she is naive.
Right.
We say that of adult people that they have a childlike naivete, because we expect adult people to know better. So this is also maybe there's a certain kind of asymmetry between ascribing naivete to people or to yourself. To yourself, you can ascribe it maybe only retrospectively. Oh, I have been so naive in that situation. But it would be maybe more like oxymoronic to say, I'm really naive right now. So there is this, as a posthumous character of naivete, maybe.
That's extremely interesting, I think. David, I wanted to ask you, does this resonate also with your experience with regard to the avant-garde and Marxist philosophy? And there's a lot of, I think, belief in that. Sometimes it unfolds in a way that there's also a lot of
So I think what I was saying before is directly related to that somehow, because and what you were saying now also in a different way. But I want to get back to this growing up and sort of understanding that you weren't, how naive we were. I think that this is extremely interesting and extremely important, because indeed, like it's always also when it's too late, you have the realization. It's not only post festum that you understand that you were naive, but it's always too late, the moment of recognition. How that relates to truth, what you were saying before. I was thinking that, there's nothing greater than someone who naively is desiring the truth. Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is that actually people who could, when it's already too late, who say how naive I was back then, what they've lost, if you will, is that burning desire, right? So actually, like, for me, my positive image of naivete would be linked to a burning desire to know something that you don't know, actually. And that's the thing that you lose. That you lose the impetus to go and, for an example, before, and bringing this back to what you asked me about Marxism or aesthetics or whatever, Soviet this or that, there was this great moment in 1975, or 76, is either like the year I was born or a year after, when, and there's a film that documents this, when the Mona Lisa was brought to Moscow, to the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. And it was a big deal because, they didn't have, they had their collection of, whatever classic art, but they didn't usually have like visiting exhibitions. And, of course it was, the whole Soviet Union knew, they didn't know much else, that the Mona Lisa was the greatest artwork of all time. So there was really a line around the block. And Soviet television made this film about it, which is probably the kitschiest, weirdest film you could ever see. It really looks like a porno movie from the 70s. It has the music of a porno movie and the aesthetics of a porno.
It's a kind of quasi-documentary.
It's a quasi-documentary, people just standing in line, waiting to see the Mona Lisa and what happens to their faces when they see her. And like this like the rapture of meeting the Mona Lisa and like all the projected desires onto the Mona Lisa. And there's something very perverse about the way that it's filmed and the way that it's done. But it doesn't change anything about this incredible desire for people, that they were inculcated in socialist countries. I mean, this, to sort of desire the truth, the privileged truth that you would find through art. And it was something actually that how naive we were, to believe in. That's actually the big difference between Soviet Marxism and Western Marxism, is that Soviet Marxism does actually still believe in that privileged truth that's accessible through art. And we can argue, is it a naive belief or not? How naive we are. Probably.
But would it be right to say that this film, the way you described it, so you see people queuing, you can sense the excitement, the anticipation, and then perhaps you see some of the people that have seen the artwork, and there's a sort of post-coito almost kind of something happened, but
it's
you don't know
more
what.
like 1,000 plateaus of desire. Like you really have. They're all standing in line and they're overjoyed. And this is Soviet television. There can be nothing, no letdown here. It's just it's just going into outer space basically in the end. And that's also quite it's a strange thing to watch these days. Also because there's a lot of the position of the camera, which is not naive and which is making a kind of joke, because you don't film somebody's lips like that, right? Quivering at the Mona Lisa.
Do you happen to remember the title? Maybe we can
I'll find
put
it.
in the show notes.
It's online somewhere.
Yeah.
I can find it.
Raven. Again, I wanted to ask you. It's the same question, but I think we're also so different. So, would you say that being naive is inherently, as I think we have come to this point, to maybe venture and say this, that it's inherently tainted with the sense of loss or something that happened, too late, and something that we are only, like you said, I think it's a brilliant observation. We don't ever say that children are naive. I mean, this is the default kind of state. We only use this to describe grown-ups' behavior, and also quite usually, I would say, in a pejorative manner. It's already, there's this built-in value judgment into this, and I think what we're looking for, what we're touching now, is something that's positive about this notion. So.
Yeah, I think, Jasmin said earlier too, in saying that the possibility of saying, I am naive, and I think there's something about that speaks about the self-awareness of being naive. I don't know if that is possible, right? I mean, maybe part of it is that you are not aware that you are naive, and that's what naivete is. And it was really interesting then thinking about what seems to be a paradox of then gaining wisdom, so you are no longer naive, but then at the same time as you are seeking this truth, that your world is becoming smaller, and you're setting up your own new naivete, I suppose, of having a very limited, worldview about what is possible. So thinking back about this innocence that a child has, that it could be seen as the most expansive moment in one's life, that anything is possible and anything being told to you could be true. And
like the Santa Claus.
Like Santa Claus, yeah. And so to just think of more on the positivity of the term, that is a goal in itself, to actually be in a position where everything could be possible. And in thinking about what is the opposite, then I guess to think about the negative connotation of being naive as thinking that you have attained the wisdom that you were seeking.
A stupid person doesn't know that they're stupid, right? This is maybe. But I wanted also to follow up on that, and because we're also meeting on the occasion of your exhibition, and in my understanding, your practice carries a lot of, if not a willful attempt at being naive, but perhaps reconsidering or challenging certain set standards or what is accepted. And by this I mean your engagement with classical music notation vis-a-vis what you decide to do, implementing symbols, signs, and references. So yeah, I think I wanted to ask you quite straightforwardly, do you think this is a version of naivete that you try to employ in your practice, or this is too much said?
Yeah, I haven't thought about it until, preparing for this. I suppose I was thinking that it might, trying to find ways in which it relates to my practice. And I'll be thinking about that with the notation, because the notation is really just to solve the problems of music that the Western notation can't relay to anybody who's playing it. And so it can be, and sometimes it expands the classical notation as well. And so I think, there is this kind of naivete of classical musicians who believe that that is the pinnacle of music making, is achieving this virtuosity on their instrument, being able to play complexly notated music. And yeah, I think complexity is a big part of some of that rule. So especially in Europe versus the United States, in the 20th century, you had this kind of more focus on complexity, whereas in the U.S. you had more kind of minimal gestures. You had John Cage, you had more chants, kinds of employments in composition. And so, thinking about my own practice, on Thursday I'll be performing myself with electronics, and I often think about what that is, because people say, is it improvised? Is it something planned you'll be doing? And those solo performances consist of me bringing my tools, and these tools are chosen because they're unwieldy. I know how they work, but I know that they work in a certain way that they might change every time I do a performance. So these are effects pedals, microphones, different objects, and mixers and tape machines. And I've chosen them because they're very unwieldy. And so I don't know really what they're going to do. I know they will work in a certain way, but there's a plan, I suppose, that I will turn them on, but I just don't know what they're going to do, and that's how I like to make music. I think when I'm composing music, writing a score for somebody, to me that's a problem that I have to solve. I'm writing the score to solve some kind of musical problem. But when I'm composing, or when I'm doing these improvisations with myself or with other improvisers, I like to have these unwieldy situations where I guess the problem is just figuring out where it's going to go next, and maybe correcting that, if you will. Because it shouldn't have to be a problem to play music with your friends. That's not something to be solved. So I think for me it's just the unknowable about the situation that I've set up on the table in front of me.
I think it's extremely interesting because we are far away from this perhaps immediate association of a person being naive as someone who would gloss over things, who would look superficially at things or not engage willfully. But I think we are maybe thinking of it as something that's an active cognitive process. And I wanted to ask you, Jasmin, about this. Do you think, because I think now, I mean, also I suppose all of us thought about this meeting, and somehow we have some thoughts with which we're coming to the table. But now what occurs to me, it's but I would say there's a certain potential for renewal in this idea of naivety. Something that's, of course, like you said, it's always too late. But then I think in seeking it, there is this potential, like you said, Raven, this kind of potential of looking at things from a perspective that is genuinely different and allows us to yeah, I would say it's a potential for renewal. I would call it that.
Mm. Yes, I think maybe here there is like naivety could also be something like a lack of reflection, but then of course when you go to this end where you over reflect, you become doubtful, skeptical, paranoid, then you seek a certain kind of naivete, or at least maybe what I heard when you were talking, Raven, was maybe naivete in a sense also of intuition, like going with your intuition, or also again trust. You don't know whether and how all things work, but you trust it somehow will work, and maybe you go with your intuition. And I think what goes lost in over reflecting is also this intuitive access to the world, to engaging with the world. And then I think also there's this other aspect where you can, so in this moment where it's too late, when you have been betrayed by someone, for example, and you say, oh, I was so naive, but you can again decide for yourself, okay, but I don't want my good picture of humanity or so become destroyed by this one experience. I still want to be trusting in humanity or in people, whatever. So you can also maybe willfully decide not to over-reflect and to maybe decide for a certain kind of naivete, although there is this, of course, then I think it is a bit contradictory to say, I want to be naive now, but in a less strong sense, you could maybe return, like what you said, or renew a certain kind of, in the sense of this good-mindedness towards the world.
What would you say, David? I think of this especially vis-a-vis, again, the Soviet avant-gardes and a kind of what I would identify as willful naivete, perhaps. Because on the other hand, I would say it's a very self-righteous effort. I don't know what there is, the motivation, but the will to change the world and to step to the world and to the society with, yeah, I suppose, more good intentions than bad. It's a sort of a willful inhabiting of this.
I don't know. I think. So anyway, to talk about the October Revolution and its implications is something very, very exotic today, first of all. So it puts us all in a kind of strange position, actually, of being, well, not naive, but ignorant, actually, just about what that was, because it's a long time ago. Somehow there are lots of myths and, stories out there about it, but what do we know? So that's the first problem. I'm almost reluctant to open that can of worms. But since if we're going to go for that,
we could expand.
We can maybe talk about generally,
exactly,
like what is art. So the one thing that always fascinated me about this October Revolution and all what happened in the 20th century is the general, and it's a problem in all societies all over the world, it's a global problem, is this problem of that art actually, until the 20th century, was something that was really completely elitist, if you talk about high art. So what you were talking about before about musical notation, of course, this existed only for the upper middle class. Okay, it was needed for the upper middle class to entertain itself, like Netflix or something. You needed this notation to have that the girl, the daughter of the house could play the Schubert for the family. That's a sad form of democratization of Schubert. That's not what that was for, although he was writing this for that. So he was not naive also in writing this music that sounds so beautiful, for an example. I'm just improvising here, but I think that what happened in what's so incredible in these moments after 1917, and maybe in other similar moments in history that you could put into a kind of revolutionary sequence, is that there's a huge interest of people who had no interest and no access previously to culture, that they suddenly look at it and they want something from it. And it's always a big question, can culture provide this? So, you know, maybe the desire is too great, and actually culture itself and, you know, professionals who are no longer naive will say that culture cannot provide any of this.
But would you say it's a naive desire? Perhaps it's interesting to think of it that way.
It's interesting. It's interesting. I'm very much with Raven.
Mm-hmm.
I really like this image of like that a child is, what's great about children is that, first of all, anything is possible, and second of all, anything is true. So like there's this incredible openness, and also there's this incredible responsibility actually of, you know, like when something becomes true or false in that proposition. It really means something. It's the moment where a meaning happens. To say that, oh, I was so naive is almost from another position where there are no meaning is possible anymore, where you're blocking, nothing is possible. If I was so naive vis-a-vis this and that and that and this. So I have to say that like the avant-garde never fascinated me. What never fascinated me was the jaded gesture of someone trying to break with painterly culture, for an example, like Malevich, saying, all painterly culture, this is all so sophisticated. He was a participant of that painterly culture. It was only because he was
beneficiary of it.
Beneficiary of it. He was wanting to be naive or wanting to be childlike, wanting to erase everything he knew. But that was also kind of, you know, at the same time retaining his privileges, right? So that never really interested me so much. I was more always interested in the incredible pressure of all these people coming from, you know, the middle of nowhere, wanting something from art that other people already think, oh, how boring, you know, who wants to listen to, I don't know, Mozart anymore, would say someone who's all into, you know, Stravinsky and Prokofiev and, you know, all that. And yet, you know, maybe some workers actually want to hear Figaro for the first time. They can't help themselves, you know. And that's I always thought that was the more interesting part of that in some ways, because it also puts us with our, you know, avant-gardist, post-avant-garde practices in a very tricky position, you know, vis-a-vis ourselves. And like, you know, what you were saying before is like you're trying to perfect your craft as a kind of person working in a post-avant-garde field, honestly trying to attain some position of knowledge, and then finding that it's also somewhat futile at a point, and having to build encumbrances for yourself and so on. I completely sympathize and yeah, often find myself doing similar things.
No, I thank you, because for myself as a Polish person, at least the way I understood it when I was still at the academy, it's a story of disappointments. It's a story of undelivered promises. But I think it's very interesting to look at it the way you're saying, that you're not interested in that kind of idea. Thank you. Idea of this prophetic, mythical kind of presence of an artist, but more rather the feel that it creates, the genuine interest that perhaps people want to participate in this moment when culture becomes, well, if not universal, then definitely way more accessible than it used to be. I can say that. I find it extremely interesting, but also what I'm thinking of now is, so if we think of being naive as we were talking about it, I think there's a very strong component, obviously, of this intuition, like you said, Jasmin, and of, if not challenging purposefully things, but perhaps opening oneself to way more opportunities or readings. But then, what about the idea of verifiability? Like, isn't this I think it's something that's close to this, but it's this kind of experiment that can no longer be replicated, maybe? What would you say, Jasmin? I think it's... because it's a different kind of science, I would say.
Yeah, so maybe also in what David just said, so there is certainly this romanticization of naivete, and that comes from a very arrogant place, and at the same also maybe colonizing view sometimes when you say, okay, only Western education is real education, so whoever lacks that education is naive or innocent or doesn't know something, while there are completely other forms of knowledge that are just not acknowledged as knowledge, for example, here, or education. So of course there is something like knowledge in a more narrative, oral sense, and because European Western cultures are so fixated on written things, they only acknowledge written things as knowledge forms. And at the same time, there is something to it, to reproducing it, maybe, which is also necessary, for example, especially in the context of Western science, in empirical experiments, sometimes in social sciences or so when they do a qualitative research, and there is different kinds of methods sometimes and ways of asking questions to people that are doing the experiments, then they use students in early stages of their career or their student program because they are not biased. So there is this idea of also there is a very positive aspect of not knowing things, of being unbiased, being maybe naive about methods and how to conduct research properly, that actually can result in greater knowledge afterwards, or in a more objective, more neutral knowledge, because they don't know how, like according to this school of thinking or school of methodology, they were supposed to ask a question, and that makes it more basic or more naive, but in the end it will be better for the knowledge production.
Yeah, but then we're very close to this idea of, move fast and break things, of just being reckless, perhaps, which also has its own consequences. But I'm very much interested in what you're saying. I mean, I know personally few people who are surprisingly to me, in very high-ranking positions in finance, and they absolutely do not come from a financial background, and the way they were accepted to their posts was also the way they were tested was absolutely not immediately relevant to the economy or the economic system as we understand it. So I think this is very much in play. So it's a yet different understanding of being naive, perhaps, that we carry unknowingly, again.
I think it's also apparent in the notion of naive art, right, which is also highly problematic, of course, but this idea of you have not been spoiled or ruined by by knowledge. You have not been spoiled by artistic methods or painting methods or so.
Interesting. Because, I'm just thinking about, different practices, actually existing artistic practices, and how, what's spoiled and what's not, So I'm also a musician somehow, and I've been playing my whole life, and I used to sort of be against knowledge, in a way, musical knowledge at least. I wanted to just play and wanted to, be true to the original naive beauty of my playing. And I got extremely bored with it, I have to say, at some point, and really, I understood suddenly that, the knowledge that I had so, out of a position of privilege really rejected, I don't even need this, suddenly you find yourself actually wanting to study music theory. Suddenly you want to, learn all this. You want to have all the chops. Even you're never going to use it, you know that. But, you sort of want to you really and that was actually the first time that I had like some energy again about all of that. And I've got to say, it works that way in other fields too. And
I mean, you started to learn those things anew? Or?
Yeah, the second you start to reject knowledge because you think you know it all, or you think you don't need it, and who needs that even?
Why would you say
you put yourself
different?
in the position of a kind of superior. Actually, you think you're being all like original and true to your own subjectivity, but what you're actually doing is just being stupid. And I say that about myself, not about you.
But it's not. No. But it's not about you think you know it.
If we're already at it.
It's also about thinking you can always access it, right? I think this is like it's always there. You know, like it's one day. You know, and
True.
you know, everything happens. It's just we don't die. You know, we do everything. It's just we don't realize that there will be never that moment to reach for this, and I find it extremely interesting, Raven.
Yeah. I mean, David reminded me of something that happens in my own practice. Is people ask me all the time, ask me what I'm listening to. What are you listening to? And so there's times I tell them, I'm not listening to anybody else's music because I have a deadline for this thing that I'm working on. If I listen to that person's music, I'm afraid it'll end up in this new thing I'm working on. So I try to isolate myself so I can finish this project. But that is another kind of self-imposed naivete. And then when that project is done, I do crave this. What should I be listening to? And so it's kind of back and forth too. And it's I'm purposefully isolating myself from this knowledge. I could be listening. I won't even go to see live music because I'm afraid, something will encroach or it'll become too influenced by this other thing, or I'll become distracted. And so
that's really interesting because in the beginning you said naivety is all about community, and now it's about isolation.
Yeah,
so there it is. I mean, I totally relate. It has both aspects.
Yeah.
And it's extremely interesting, and I have to say, but it's how it is. I have no artworks at home. I just find it extremely distracting. It's such a load of energy that I identify with them that I'd rather not. I appreciate. I mean, I would go on a Sunday. I would go and look at stuff, but I just feel that this is something that's so intense, and when I'm also in the midst of a creative process, when I try to write or work with another artist, I think this is just such a strong presence. And then, Raven, I wanted to ask you, but maybe not so much as to apply the idea of being naive, but I think there is something in this particular work, or it's a series, Fortit Kalasa, because it's an homage also to that one person, but also to other people. So I wanted to invite you maybe to say a few words about this series, but also I'm curious about this rift that is there very much in the biography of her. That I think there is something extremely strong, which I wouldn't call naive, but I think there is a huge effort that she had, as much as I can say so, that she had put in her life to work around this idea of being perhaps forcibly taught, perhaps having to understand things differently. I find it very productive. Perhaps you would like to expand on that, and maybe just to say a few words about the work itself, so that we could all understand.
Yeah, the work upstairs is a series of graphic notated scores, and the series is called For Zikalasha. And I'd come upon Zikalasha in research years ago. I had discovered that she had written an opera in the 1930s. And Zikalasha is a Native American woman from the Dakota tribe. And that was the only thing I had found out about her, was that she had made this opera, this composition. And it was notated in Western notation. And it was also said that it was the work was co-composed with this man. I can't remember his name, but he, so they had a co-credit for this opera, and so I was trying to find the score and was researching her life and found all this other amazing things she had done that she wasn't necessarily known for. She had written poetry, fiction, written a lot of political essays on the state of American Indian people at the turn of the century. She was a musician. She taught violin. She also did a lot of other activist work, founded the National Congress of the American Indian, which still exists today. But it was very complicated too. She was, for instance, someone who was an early advocate of trying to getting Native American people the right to vote, and she would go around to different communities, speaking about this advocacy, but at the same time, these Native communities, were saying, well, I don't want the right to vote. I don't even want to be a part of this country. Why are you representing this country and trying to get us to opt into this system? She also was actually against some of the plant usage that some tribes were using. So some tribes were using peyote, and she thought this was something that was very destructive. And so a complicated figure within the Native American community at that time, but nonetheless appreciated, underrepresented, and it had only been more recently that there's been more and more writings about the work she's done. And the musical work is still very kind of mysterious as well. She, of course, read music notation, was trained classically, but there's not any other compositions other than this Sundance opera that was written. And again, there's this assumption, or had been this assumption, that this man that she collaborated with actually wrote it and she sung songs to him, but no one knows if that's the case or not. So I think her artistic work, in at least the music side, was diminished, or assumed that the man had to write this for her. And so I was thinking of writing an opera about her, or some other kind of maybe vocal work, and I decided that the series would be better to acknowledge contemporary women, indigenous women in North America who are navigating the 21st century, working in music, experimental music, but also have other parts of their practice and lives that are involved in activism, other creative pursuits. And so those are the 12 scores on the wall. And they all have references to tribal geometries that each of the women are from, numerologies, other kinds of actions, perhaps in the piece, replicate some of the work that they do. So you'll see some references to classical music notation within them, and that's because that person also works with classical notation in some way. And I think the scores themselves have a potential of being very mysterious, but at the same time, there's the instructions as well to share with people what it is about and how you perform it. And there's an invitation that anybody could really perform these. One doesn't even need to necessarily have a mastery over an instrument in some of them. One of them is for lamps and radios, going around the room or the space or the country and turning on and off lamps and radios. And so, I think there's a component of a lot of my scores that are an invitation for people to, at any level, to engage with the work. And for me, it's been trying to create this large spectrum of that. I have works for kids, actually. I have a piece for drums that kids could play, and the kids actually do it better than than the adults, because it's meant to have this kind of variation in what they play. So it's a kind of broken telephone thing where I hit the drum, and then you hit the drum, and so on. It keeps going around, but adults take it too seriously. They try to really replicate exactly, and the more masterful, in quotes, the drummer is, the more they accurately try to replicate. Whereas the kids, becomes more a mimicry, right? You know, even a teasing. You know, I play something and you do it, but you're gonna even maybe make the same funny face I make when I do it. You know, and so the kids end up doing this kind of thing, and it turns into a much more expansive piece as a result.
What do you think? I'm thinking of the notion, David, of accessibility, actually, versus jadedness also, somehow. In our industry, so to speak, I very consciously refuse to use the word art world because I'm quite allergic to this idea. Like, I mean, we have the music industry, we have the film industry, and I very firmly believe that this is nothing less than an industry that we are complicit in. But then how to make things accessible and how to find this energy that you Raven just mentioned. I'm thinking, David, if there's I don't know, an example of a work or an institution or something that comes to your mind that
not necessarily,
yeah,
but
I'm hard pressed.
But there are,
myself.
I think what Raven was just telling, and you know, there are countless instances in any practice where you manage actually to reclaim, you open up new possibilities, right. You open up, you regain some of that, and you fight against that jadedness. If we were all just jaded and you know, sort of energyless, it wouldn't work, right? There would be none of this. So, but it's a question, it's more a question of actually of society and of what happens outside of artistic practices. So what happens with an audience? Who is this even for? What is this done for? When does a community arise around a work? What kind of community is it? And so on. And this is really, I mean, there it gets really complicated, and there you have to start talking more also about a larger politics. You know, you have to start talking then about why is it that people prefer not to know any of this stuff and not to be, you know, involved in any of it, and just don't care for it. It's not just us who's, you know, sort of making a defensive position. It's also, it's a whole system of relations. It's a totality of relations that we're talking about. And then, you know, we go exactly from the opposite, actually, of, you know, what we would want to be. Actually, for any artist, I think, it's almost impossible to work in this paranoid mode.
It is, I believe so.
So, like, to constantly look behind your shoulder, to constantly be like Benjamin's angel of history, you know, going forward and seeing nothing but ruins, and now not actually looking forward at all to anything, but just seeing like the whole shit that you left behind. This is the most depressing thing on earth. And after, I don't know, you know, like after some several decades in this job somehow and in this field, that's my biggest fear. So, you know, like to be able to turn your head and to actually look forward and to have a sort of open road before you, of course, is like this incredible thing that everyone wants, right? You don't want to be encumbered by, you know, this feeling of like, oh, I know it all. You know, you want to hear it again. You want to hear the musical piece, or you want to look at the work that you've seen 1,000 times as if you've never saw it before, actually. And that's something that I think a lot of practices are made, you know, sort of trying to approximate that. The bigger problem is how do you get it out there, and how do you get other people involved in that? And that's you know, a very hard work somehow. I think that a lot of, far too few people do that, maybe among, you know, in our kind of part of that division of labor. What I mean is curators. Yeah. There are maybe not enough people who are doing the hard kind of legwork. I think for artists, it's more, among artists, it's more common, because you have to, unless you're, you know, who has this kind of studio practice that's completely autistic and like, you know, only focused on itself, that would actually be beautifully naive somehow. Nobody works like this. So you're forced to build a community. You're forced to, you know, build a context where something becomes possible and where it doesn't all become logged down in mutual recriminations and paranoia. But I think that, of course, you know, the general paranoid tenor of our time is making that really, really hard. And it makes it easier to be naive toward culture from the position, naive, again, like this, saying like, oh, I don't want to know anything about that. I don't know anything about that. I don't care about that. I don't go to museums. I don't go to shows. I don't look at that. I don't read books. I don't give a shit. I just watch Netflix a little bit and then I go to sleep. Like that would be the bad naive, the kind of like pretending that you're basically a child who needs to be spoon-fed everything, all information, all, Amazon this, Netflix that. And that's, I guess, that's a kind of, bringing it back to the beginning of the conversation, the bad kind of naive.
Right.
That actually knows that they're, doing a ton of wrong. I mean, I'm finding it hard at the moment just to bring it like really on the basic level of political stuff. Sorry to do that. I guess we've been having such a nice abstract conversation. But for me, it's really tough, honestly, to talk at the moment, because I have a lot to do with people from two contexts, from Russia and from Israel. And both, like, I gotta say, it's hard to have a conversation that if it doesn't involve the shit that's going on like across the border respectively because of the militaries of those countries and discussing like how is this going to end, any conversation actually seems exactly this kind of bad kind of naive that we just don't want to know, we don't care, let's talk about the weather, let's talk about birds and bees and no culture, nothing. This is also too complicated because then you would touch upon those violent things. So let's just and then in the end, that's, this kind of, fake childishness of a kind of, fascist mentality. I think that's a very interesting thing.
It's like happy-go-lucky.
Yeah.
Like we are in a different world and...
but like the sun is shining and it was the best time of my life and I don't really know. And if Hitler hadn't killed all the Jews, it would have still been like a great memory. Like I think that for a lot of Germans actually who grew up and who were like young as when that was all happening, that's what that was. It was being protected and insulated and being told, no, that military defeat that was just, you don't see the full picture and you don't have to. We'll take care of you, and this kind of like Behütung, you would say in German, like just taking, ensconcing people.
I guess there's also the other side of that, the completely nihilist, like there is no solution, so let's not talk about it. Let's we're not going to ever learn anything about this. It's all, going to hell and there's no solution. So conversation over that, there's that too, where they think that nothing is going to resolve.
No, the reason I'm asking this question is I'm also asking myself, being complicit in this industry, like, well, how we could do a better job, because I think artists are one of the few last standing that are not jaded, and they have this almost a privilege, I would say, but the rest of this industry is making it very difficult, in my understanding, to do their job in the sense of having the energy. And paradoxically, David, I wouldn't agree with you, because I think there's a very weird thing, because jadedness does come hand in hand with energy in this industry, quite a lot of it. And this is the biggest danger, because there's a lot of people who are disillusioned and they still, they're still very, very active. So this is what I was getting at.
It's the kind of Tony Blair energy, a ghoulish energy.
Yeah, it is a zombie energy.
Nobody remembers Tony Blair. we tried so hard to forget.
But I think this is so. What we're talking about, the exhibition done by Jeremy at the invitation of Krzysztof, your exhibition, Raven, I think those are really different points of access, and something that's genuinely outside of like the manual as we have come to understand it. That's why I find it very precious. But yet, maybe this is what it is. Maybe it just doesn't happen very often. But then am I jaded in saying that? Might be. Jasmin, I wanted to ask you how you, as perhaps not so directly complicit, but you also studied art history as a not so directly complicit person, look at this, meaning the infrastructure and the access and how we try to mediate the work of artists and what
Yeah,
kind of poor job we're doing probably.
I worked as an art mediator in some institutions, and so what I found, so in one sense, I think what is so special about art, also, or maybe that's only to me, is that it is not this kind of everything has to be clear and there is one definite answer, as it is in many other fields, or also even other museums where when you explain nature or technology or so, these have very different approaches in how they show things and explain things to the visitors. And in art, things are a bit more open-ended, maybe. But of course, so also once I was writing these brochures for the visitors of an art exhibition, and colleagues, or I was writing it together with colleagues, and it was awful. It was not understandable at all. It was a very artsy language that sounded very sophisticated, but didn't explain anything, especially not anything to someone outside of the, I use the word art world now, working in the industry. And so I think that is also, maybe the difficulty of mediating art, that you keep it like a little bit open-ended in the sense of that it can mean different things to different spectators. At the same time, you have to give some hints, especially with modern contemporary art, where you have to have some maybe knowledge even of the theoretical backgrounds of the discussions that were taking place at the time, or are taking place at the time. Sometimes artworks, contemporary artworks, are very political, and they refer to very special political events that you maybe don't know about, and just knowing about the event will open up the artwork like a key. Like maybe, as you, Raven, said about your artwork upstairs, you have like the little legend that tells you how to read the notation. And I found it very interesting because the symbols up there, geometrical symbols, they look very mysterious, but once you have the key, it's very intuitively or it's very easy to understand how they, or some parts of it at least, how you are to read this notation. So I think this is what maybe what it means to mediate art, that you have to give some keys, and maybe they wouldn't work for everyone, but they have to open up a little bit, but not too much also, because this is so nice about art, that everyone can relate, in principle at least, and see different things in it maybe. But yeah, I'm still sort of an outsider, so maybe you see these things very different.
No, I agree. I think there's an interesting thing here, though, that you just referred to, which is like because things have to be kept open and sort of vague, you need a really complicated, vague language to describe that, yes, which actually closes things completely and makes them inaccessible. I really want to dwell on that for a second, because I think it's the paradox that we sort of live in, and it's also a bit of a social paradox, really, because on the one hand there's this desire, like, come and see the work, and on the other hand, no, but you won't understand it, and I'm like, get it, go. This is the kind of weird situation that we're in somehow always. And I think, for curators and art mediators, probably the most useful thing to do is to force themselves, at least once in their life, you really have to force yourself to write simple English. There's this thing called simple English, there's even a whole Wikipedia written in simple English, where you prohibit yourself from using fancy words, any fancy words, and you explain everything. So, for an example, you don't say, "Oh, this work refers to the commodity form," or something, but you explain what's a commodity, what's the commodity form, when did this go, as this philosopher, and so on. If you start really mediating all bits of it, and you try, instead of just glossing over it and hoping that people will sensually engage with the work, which is, I think, actually the other really terrible thing, is you come to a museum or a show and there are no labels. There are no annotations, nothing, no contextualization, and you really treat people like they're really stupid, because like, why would I put this on the wall? Because if you read it, you won't even understand it. So you can just understand, like, maybe you can get it a little bit, like the feeling, of course, not as much as the artist. And that is really, like, that's the most, I think, disdainful of all moves, is just to eliminate the whole discourse entirely. I think it is, though, what it creates, you know, like that whole system of art mediation that we're stuck with, in a way, creates the situation of people who are actually very naive as to the older art history that isn't so vague and isn't so open-ended. So like all that stuff that, you know, we had to study when we were studying art history, actually now nobody knows, right? So like nobody even gives a shit about any of this, like problems of realist painting and so on. Or in classical music, it's similar. You know, people are not invested into understanding.
It's probably not
functions.
even in the language models. It's probably so remote to knowledge that even, you know, those AI models wouldn't even picture that.
You have
ask
to
them.
really,
Yeah.
you can't. It's really
It's
actually
ancient knowledge. It is. That's what.
it's
it
very
is.
hard to get ChatGPT to draw. That's a really interesting thing. It's like I've been trying to tell ChatGPT, like, to make a drawing of this and that kind, and you know what to do, and like it's idiot. It doesn't know anything about that. It can write you like a kind of postmodern text. Fine, that's like perfect, like better than Pynchon, you know. But not with figurative art, for an example. And that's an interesting thing, because people are naive as to the laws of those things. Those were very, you know, propositionally law-based systems somehow, where you couldn't, if you didn't know the rule, you would, you know, people would look at you. I mean, at some point in history, probably you could get burned at the stake for playing a certain interval. You know, by accident, you played a fifth, that's it, you're out, you know, like, but, no, I mean, it's true, but then, you know, now, who would know any of this, who would appreciate any of this, and who would have the language to talk about it? We have the language to talk about some kind of modernist, postmodern key, but there's so much knowledge that's been lost, so, you know, as seeing that as, there's also what I find really problematical is that there's a discourse that comes from the cultural world of saying, oh, all of that knowledge is just, you know, like really, it's harmful actually, because it's like all, you know, it was dominating the world until the early 20th century as this incredibly, you know, repressive Enlightenment, Eurocentric and so on. All true. But actually, if you don't know something, how can it repress you? This is also a really, really interesting question. So if you declare something to be harmful to begin with, and you just push it out of sight and out of mind, that's a very interesting thing. So you'd actually, then you'll be truly naive about all this violence that was being caused by it, because you have no way to appraise it or understand it at all. And I think that, you know, that we are culturally much more discursively, that only happened like in the last 10 or 15 years, you know, but like culturally we're way ahead of that, because for 100 years or so, all of this mimetic, classical, harmony-based, rule-based tradition was, you know, already eroded fully by the early 20th century. Nobody believed in that at all, except for, you know, some naive workers who were trying to, you know, get hold of some kind of culture, any culture, you know. So that's an interesting thing that we lack. We actually, like, every time when you go into a museum, like you go into a museum of classical art with a, you know, contemporary art people, and like look at you know, they see all kinds of things, and it's kind of weird if you studied art history to hear some of the things that people say, really, like about Bruegel, or I don't know, you know, like just Rembrandt, whatever, you know, and stuff that people don't know. For an example, that you know, the difference between alla prima and like a grisaille-based painting or whatever, you know, this stuff. This is like, and it seems like maybe if you studied art history, it seems like it's a kindergarten problematic.
I don't think so.
But
I think it's one of the things that we pretend to know. That's the crux of the matter. It's this kind of knowledge that is, again, it's somewhere. I mean, you think you'll reach for it when you'll need it. Turns out you don't necessarily need to reach for it. But doesn't mean you know things. It's like those basic, as much as I understand what you're saying, is kind of basic things that come before the discourse. I don't think they are common knowledge, even amongst art historians. I don't think they are.
But like even the ability just to say like, because there was this thing in the 2000s, beginning in the 2000s, there was this incredible fetishization. You were talking before about naive art and naive, like naive painting, where people any painting was good because it was like the return of painting, and oh yeah, somebody still paints. And it could be the naive or the better in a way. It just, as long as it's color. And to people who come from these cultures where painting was valorized because it was politically important or whatever, like in Eastern Europe, in Russia especially, painting was like almost like to make an important painting was to write a novel. It was really politically, fetishized somehow. And, the quality, the formal quality of it was important, for what that's worth. And they were bigger formalists in some way than Western artists, in their figurative world.
But no longer so. You think we miss this kind of subconsciously?
I do, yeah. I miss the let's say the understanding that this is shit and this is not, like the ability to differentiate between something that's truly just awful.
And how did you learn the difference?
I don't think I ever really did fully. I mean,
Okay, you're being humble, but I can speak about myself, and then let's see what you say to that. Because I felt I have been bombarded with all of those masterpieces for years and years. And when I saw something that's not in the handbook, I was completely helpless. So I couldn't see the scale. I couldn't see. And another thing is, as many of my friends are who work in this industry, they wanted to be artists, but they know how much it takes, what an effort it is to create something, and they are very quick to also assess things if it's perhaps quality or not. But for me, it took me a long time because I just had to see a lot of haphazardly created stuff just to understand. And I still, modestly, as you said, I would still not say I have this skill, but I had to have a serious reality check to understand what I have been equipped with. It's like, perhaps I could relate to you, Raven. It's like you're being, kind of bombarded with some kind of knowledge, and what does this do to you in the end? Because it changes you, but in what way you would never understand until you are somehow confronted with perhaps the opposite of it, or lack of it, or need to deploy it in a different way. Yeah.
When I studied art history in Kassel, the historians, we theoretical art historians, were in the same building as the artists. And what was once very interesting to me was when we had a project together with the artists, and we were supposed to write text for the artworks, but we were also accompanying the process of how the artworks were made. And I was very surprised by how rough the feedback was. So when the artwork was still in process, it was really, everyone discussed openly about it and assessed it, evaluated it, and it was kind of a rough tone, very honest and open, which is of course necessary, I guess. But I wasn't aware of that, of course, I was also only confronted with a perfect result when you study art history. It's also this high culture products and never really the making. I was never really seeing the making. Of course, you see some sketches, but it's often then from masters. This was also something I really learned in this project, that how difficult, the kind of difficulties artists in doing the artwork confront, and that you just see, okay, this works, this doesn't work, and you think, I couldn't say that at all at this moment, at this stage, because it's unfinished, it's undone. So it was very interesting to see the feedback that they were very quickly in to assess in which direction the artwork could go or could not go. And then, of course, maybe also this again goes back to our starting point, that in what sense knowledge can be at the same time a burden, but also maybe when you're too technical, too stubborn with sticking to a book, to a textbook, that could be a burden, but at the same time also you need to know something to assess something properly, to evaluate a situation or an artwork properly. In the sense, naivete can be both bad and good, I guess.
So what we say, that knowledge is in some kind of weird dynamic with being naive. It could kind of dismantle it eventually. I don't know, I'm thinking. Is knowledge dangerous then, vis-a-vis this concept?
Knowledge is always dangerous. No, I mean, you know, some forms of knowledge can be really paralyzing, right? You know, there's some things that people seemingly really have the need to protect themselves from. I mean, how do you, I don't know how it is, you know, my dad lives in the United States and in New Jersey, and I have the feeling that he's only able to survive this moment by sort of half lobotomizing himself in certain directions, you know, like just cutting off certain parts of his brain and preventing them from operating. And I don't know, I mean, it's really hard to, you know, with certain, especially with the finer things in life, you know, to continue with all that, you know, like writing a novel or whatever, or, you know, translating poetry or what, how are you going to do, I mean, not that my dad is doing that, but, you know, somebody who does, how do you compose music in a moment when, you know, people are getting arrested or like next door? That's very, very hard actually to do. And it's, and that in there, it becomes heroic in a way. Because, you know, how do you, it's the easiest thing of all is just to say, you know what, I'm going to bed. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm going to bed, I can't work anymore. The war is on, that's it. You know, so I think there it becomes a real skill to kind of, you know, do this, you know, that kind of harmful autonomistic move, and, you know, like to go in full on artistic autonomy. It's very tempting, and it'll make people a lot angrier at us, like socially. Right. I think that's what's happening now, is that a lot of people are sort of like, I have to keep going. So, you know, like you retreat back into your own thing. I don't want to know about any of this. I don't want to know any about that. And then people are looking at you and like, but just look at the world. What are you doing? You know, like, why are you doing only this? So I think there's a whole new set of problems that comes up there.
Yeah, there's two things. Well, there's a few things happening, I mean, as it relates to the U.S. and Trump, and as you're telling the story of your father, like, I mean, the first kind of shielding that has happened is, you know, this is already the second term. Everyone's fatigued of having to, you know, even talk about this guy. But then what is now coming up is that, especially with younger people, is that everything is a lie. Or everything is AI generated. This video you saw of this thing happen, it's fake. It's not real. Somebody made it on AI. If you read the comments of any video you see online, it's AI. Kids will say it's AI. This isn't real. So this is a second shield of dealing with this as well, of staying naive, of assuming either there's not enough information and there never will be, or again, that it's all going to hell and there's no chance of anything being decoded. No truth is going to be revealed. And so that's the scary thing. I mean, at least in of where we're at, this is the next kind of stage of shields. Yeah, self-imposed shields. Good.
Would you say then that we could, like going back to the concept naivete, that we could say that a whole time or a whole generation or zeitgeist could be more naive than another one? Like one is very disillusioned or something, and the other one is more naive, maybe?
Yeah, I think compounded maybe with an older generation's fatigue,
Yeah.
The result with the next generation is this hopelessness that anything can be uncovered or solved.
No, I think for sure, an older generation. I mean, if I think of like the generation of the '60s or whatever, which definitely varied from country to country, right? But like, you think about people who experienced the '60s in Germany, which were specific because of all the ex-Nazis and Nazi parents, grandparents around, or the '60s in the socialist world, which are also specific because of Stalinism, and how, people really were, I think in the US, people thought of it as a kind of social revolution, sexual revolution, whatever, but I don't think it was as cosmic an event maybe as like in the socialist countries. For sure, people were so, and you see some of that in like a Tarkovsky movie or something if you watch a bit of that, and you can sort of feel it a bit. That's a naive society in that sense of like, also naively embracing capitalism, for an example. I mean, that's, if we can talk beyond all the intellectual stuff for a second, I mean, that's what this is about a lot of the time. It's people buying into something that they actually, like, you've been duped, you've been tricked. People were very naive about that. They thought that all their dreams would come true, and they didn't.
I would say that I mean, I appreciate a lot what you just said, but I would say from my perspective, if we apply this term to history, recent history, I would say for a Polish person, what started in the noughties, in the year 2000s, was the period of naivety. We really thought, and of course, let's not bring in the Fukuyama into this, but we really thought there's nothing is going to get worse. Everything is just going to get gradually, slowly better. Yeah. There's nothing virtually, maybe there's a war or two somewhere on TV. I mean, you can switch it off, no problem. This was the biggest naivety of the generation of the 80s, I would say now, to buy into this idea that, this country sends a little bit of money into some kind of unknown remote place called Brussels, and all of a sudden you have a highway. Well, that happened, more than one, but then it turned out that reality is way more complicated, and it turned out that it was built on the backs of a lot of people, and this current, I mean, recently this right-wing government that had been in power in Poland, it was a democratically elected government by the people. Mostly, those who voted for it, is like I spent quite some time thinking of this. I would say it was very much along the lines of how the Brexit voters voted. So big cities voted center, left or center, however we define those parties, and everything else was just a huge backlash and a surprise to everyone. And I think this is, if we are talking about naivete and recent history and this kind of negative connotation of it, I would say this was the last 2 decades. That was the brutal period in Europe.
Are we on time? I gotta take a bath. That's much water.
So,
you can also.
So, again, I'd like to say thank you, everyone, for joining this discussion. It's been a pleasure. So, with us today, Raven Chacon, David Riff, Jasmin Trächtler, and I would like to say deep thank you to Krzysztof Gallus and Lara Favaretto, whose invitation we have met today. My name is Krzysztof Kościuczuk, and I wish everyone a very good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.